Alright, so let's begin with some review. We have talked about questions of content, questions of assumption, and questions of structure. Questions of content, the main point question. At the end of the day, what is the author trying to get across? Why does the author believe that thing X is the case? If there are reasons, it may be your main conclusion. If there are no reasons offered in support, it's not the main conclusion. The inference question. What is it that you can prove based on the material in the passage? What do you know to be true? What can you properly infer? Pointed issue questions. We're going to get to those in this series of videos. Assumption-based questions, your necessary assumption questions. What is information needed in order to make the conclusion that is missing from the conclusion? Information that you would have to have in order to prove it, but that isn't there. That's your necessary assumption. Sufficient assumption, not necessarily necessary. You don't have to have that information for the conclusion to be true, but if you did, if you did, that would be sufficient to prove that the conclusion is true. Flaw questions. We've talked just a little bit about these. I want to talk about some flaw types, and I want to talk in some more depth about flaw questions in these videos. Weaken and strengthen. You know how to do that. You weaken an argument by attacking the necessary assumption. You strengthen an argument by asserting the necessary assumption. Evaluation questions. You remember those? We talked briefly about those. You may see one of those on the test. The evaluation question asks you what you would need to know in order to evaluate the argument. And the thing that you need to know in order to evaluate the argument is whether or not the necessary assumption is true. Resolution questions, we'll talk about those in these videos. Principle and proposition questions, those really aren't a different type. You may remember we discussed that. They are going to be four of our other types using the word principle or proposition in the question stem. We'll get to those. And we've talked about our structure questions, method. What is the method of reasoning? What is the technique of reasoning used by the argument? Role. What is the role or function that a statement plays within the argument as a whole? And parallel. Given one argument, you're asked for another that's similar in its reasoning. And you'll remember that in order to be parallel, it must be the same throughout its structure of reasoning. That is to say, if your argument is conditional in its logic, then the right answer choice must also be conditional. If your argument says, all enchiladas taste like chili, and answer choice A says most puppies will die if you beat them, don't choose answer choice A, because that's just gross. But also because if it says most, it is not parallel to the conditional language used in the argument. The conditions must be parallel, the conclusions must be parallel. If your argument is prescriptive, the correct answer choice must also have a prescriptive conclusion. If your argument says we should eat more nachos, then the correct answer choice must say, we ought to do thing X. The chimes are there for pure aesthetic enjoyment. Parallel questions, they must be parallel all the way through. Alright, now, to begin, let's talk about some of these questions in more depth. I want to begin with the pointed issue questions. We'll take a look at those, at what they ask you, and a specific technique for dealing with them. And we'll start that in the next segment.